I invite you to turn to a lesser-known portion of the Old Testament, the story of Ruth. I'll let you start searching for it now. If you're using the Red Bible in front of you, I can make it easy for you, page 187. Before we step into Ruth, let me tell you about Patricia. The first time I met Patricia, I think she was about 85 or 86 years old. It was prompted by a phone call from my sister on the West Coast who said, "Paul, it turns out we have a relative we've never met." And she said, "I'm hosting a gathering in my home, and all of our known family can come and meet Patricia, and she's going to bring her daughters." And so here I was sitting in the living room of my sister's home with this cheerful, twinkle in her eye, delightful 85-year-old woman named Patricia as I was getting to know her. And it turns out she was my aunt. News to me. Better late than never, right? At age 85, I suddenly have an aunt. But the family resemblance was apparent immediately. In fact, my sister could have been her daughter. Boy, did they look alike. And so as we sat and enjoyed treats and enjoyed listening and swapping stories, Patricia surprised us by saying, "Oh, I met your father once." Again, news to us. Our dad had never said anything about it. Now, remember, my dad's an immigrant from Ireland, no siblings, and his father abandoned the family. So my dad grew up just with his single-parent mother in the days when that was a tough road. It still is. It was even tougher then. And Patricia proceeded to tell us this story that her own father, if I lose you on the family tree, don't worry about it, but her own father was my father's mother's brother. Are you there? So it would have been my grandmother's brother. His wife passed away. He, Kelly, had 3 children. And whether from not having the income or the interest, we don't know. But Kelly was not interested in raising 3 children as a single dad. And so Patricia said, "Yeah, your father was maybe 10 years old, and Kelly took us over to your grandmother's home and sent us 3 children to go in the other room to play with your father when he was about 10, while the brother and sister, Kelly and my grandmother, had a conversation in private." So we don't know the details of the conversation, but Kelly's trip was prompted by him wanting to appeal to his sister, my grandmother, my father's mother, to take on the 3 kids because Kelly couldn't or wouldn't parent them. Who knows what specifics were said? It didn't end well. We know that much. Patricia, being the only eyewitness we have from those meetings, and she being about 12 at the time, said, "We played with your father, the 4 of us kids, for a while, and then Kelly, our dad, came out of the room where he'd been visiting with your father's mother and said, 'Come on, kids, we're going.'" Later, Patricia told us that my grandmother declined to take on any or all of the 3 kids. I understand that. My grandmother wasn't making ends meet. They were impoverished, and so I'm sure the thought of 3 more kids just seemed financially undoable for her. Plus, she and her brother didn't have a warm relationship to begin with, and so I think her attitude was, it's your life, and I'm not going to bail you out. Those are speculation on my part, but educated guesses, not just guesses. But that was the one and only time Patricia ever met my father. And I never knew about that until Patricia was 85 and my father was deceased. Patricia went on to tell us her story. her father, Kelly, didn't raise them. He was serious when he came to my grandmother and said, "Will you take them?" And when she declined, he divvied them out to the system. Patricia ended up in the foster care system. Her brother ended up somewhere else in the foster care system. The foster care system wasn't getting great grades way back then. And so as a mid-teenager, Patricia was hired to be a servant girl and live with a family in exchange for room and board, and she would do the maid service and other miscellaneous tasks. And Patricia's a cheerful, upbeat woman. She's now in her 90s. But she talked about how hard that was and how she was treated differently, partly because of her Irish ancestry, partly because she was an indentured servant to the family. So she was not allowed to eat with the family. She slept outside in a little lean-to, and it was a tough life. And then when she reached the age of 18, they cut her loose. And she described many difficult years, and she described a marriage that really wasn't positive, but she just wanted a man in her life, and that didn't go well. And eventually, slowly, out of poverty, her circumstances turned a bit. So I met her two daughters. One of them couldn't be present. One of them's now sort of semi-famous on TV. She couldn't make it, so I have no autographs to share with you. And at 85, sitting in my sister's living room, I thought, this is a delightful, positive, cheerful woman who's got quite a story of a lot of cuts and hurts and climbing up out of a hole. And yet no bitterness, no anger. And I could see a lot of my father. The family resemblance was there, and the same twinkle in the eye was there. And I thought, I wonder what Patricia's life would have been like if my grandmother had said yes. Doesn't obligate my grandmother to say yes, but I share that story because Ruth is somewhat of a parallel to Patricia. So don't get lost in the cobwebs of Old Testament history. Ruth is the story, similar to Patricia, of a woman who really doesn't know where to turn for help, and no one owes her anything. And life is pretty scary. All of that sets us up to walk through Ruth's story today. The reason we're looking at Ruth's story is a continuation of last Sunday. So throughout this summer, we're talking about putting on the gospel glasses helps us navigate the difficult issues in our culture today. Immigrants, refugees, poverty, ethnicity are all politicized peoples these days. And in saying that, I'm not making a political comment because I haven't leaned you in any direction, except to say God's people should reclaim the spiritual understanding of vulnerable people. It is not a political issue. It has become political. But God's people need to realize that God has strong feelings about the vulnerable. So hopefully by now you have found your way to the ancient story parallel of Patricia's. She goes by the name Ruth. Interestingly, that was my grandmother's name, and then she gave that name, Ruth, as a middle name to my mother. The setting is Israel is experiencing a famine. We'll see more about that in a few moments. And because of that, people are driven to desperate times and desperate actions. And so a Jewish woman and her husband, Naomi and Elimelech, make a choice. I'm sure it was a difficult choice, and their choice is we can stay in the boundaries of our nation, Israel, and starve, or we can become immigrant refugees, leaving the nation of Israel and go into the non-Jewish, in fact, at best, tense neighbor, if not actual hated enemy, country of Moab. And they choose to live rather than starve in Israel. And so Naomi, Elimelech, and their two sons become immigrants in a foreign country, Moab. That takes us into chapter 1. I'll summarize it for you just so we can keep moving along. Elimelech dies. Naomi is now a widow. But she has her 2 sons. They're long enough in Moab that the sons marry Moabite women. Yes, some of you are thinking, didn't the Bible forbid that in the Old Testament? And you would be right. But we have no idea why. Maybe because they had been there long enough, maybe because they were at marrying age. But the 2 sons of Naomi and Elimelech marry Moabite women. The 2 women are named Orpah, which actually is where Oprah Winfrey gets her name. Her parents spelled it wrong. It's O-R-P-A-H. Orpah and her sister Ruth. Both are Moabites. Hated Moabites. Both sons of Naomi die. So just recognize that Naomi has a 3-fold grief. In Moab, her husband has died, and both her sons have died. So she has no male heirs to carry on her family or her family name, and add to that the most vulnerable position to be in was a widowed single woman in a foreign country. She's in deep trouble. She's grieving, and she makes a choice. With no family, I'm going back to my home country of Israel, Bethlehem being her hometown. She had heard that the famine had ended and that crops were growing again in Israel, and so Naomi makes a choice, and in many ways it's a cut your losses choice. Moab isn't home, Israel is home. She's lost a husband and 2 sons while being a refugee in Moab. And so Naomi determines to head back. She shares with both of her daughters-in-law, both of whom are Moabites, not Jews, encouraging them, stay in Moab. You're still young enough. You'll attract a husband. You can have children. So apparently neither Orpah, as it's known in the Bible, or Ruth have had any children with their Jewish husbands who are now dead. And Naomi says, stay in your home country. Meet a husband. Have a family. Why would you go back with me, a widow, aging, to a country that isn't your country? Orpah takes the invitation and stays in Moab. That brings us to a fairly well-known scripture, but now you know the context, Ruth 1, verse 16 to 18. Ruth replied to Naomi, do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized Ruth was determined, and that sounded pretty determined, didn't it? Basically, it's the ancient version of saying, over my dead body am I going to leave your side. When Naomi realized Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So now the tables have reversed. Naomi is returning to her native land of Israel, Bethlehem specifically, and now Ruth, the Moabite widow, her daughter-in-law, is now the immigrant refugee, and so they arrive in Bethlehem. If you want to follow along, you can look at verse 19 through 22. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women of the town exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Apparently the years in Moab haven't worn well on Naomi, plus no Elimelech and no sons. And Naomi's response, verse 20 and following, don't call me Naomi, she told them, call me Mara, which means bitter or bitterness, because the Lord has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. She is not a pleasant person, understandably so. She's come back to Israel. There is harvest now. The barley harvest is going on. But Naomi is somewhere between grief, bitterness, anger, and resentment. All those lovely words you don't want to describe you, but life has done that to her. And at her side, all she has, no husband, no sons, no one to carry on the family name. She has a daughter-in-law who's a foreigner. Vulnerable women. Chapter 2. If you need titles, just call it Boaz. Boaz is a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech, the deceased husband. Look at verse 2 and verse 3. Because you have Naomi and Ruth who have no income and no family. How are they going to survive? Literally. And that's where God's heart for the poor and the vulnerable again shows up, like we saw last week. And so it's harvest time, which means those harvesting should leave gleanings. Don't pass through the fields twice. What falls on the ground, leave it. For the people like Naomi and Ruth who depend on those scraps for survival. Chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." And so she, Ruth, went out, entered a field, began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the same clan as the deceased husband of Naomi, Elimelech. Ruth is unaware of this. How about verse 5? Boaz, owning the property, asks the overseers of the harvester, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replies, "She's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Ruth is actively picking up the gleanings because she and Naomi are going to need it to survive. Stunningly, Boaz actually speaks to her. Verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Glean here." He will go on and tell her, "Glean here in my fields." He directs the workers, do not bother, harass, assault, or take sexual advantage of this woman. All of those were real possibilities out in the field with workers. And surprisingly, he says to her, whenever you're thirsty, you can have access to the water pot. It's a lot of kindness to a non-Jewish woman gleaning in your field. None of it required from Boaz. He meets the letter of the law by just leaving the gleanings and letting the women fend for themselves. But he's going much further than that. Verse 13, Ruth recognizes what the cultural norms are. So don't just live in the story of long ago. Think about our cultural norms. Verse 13, Ruth, surprised, since I'm not even, quote, one of your servants. And yet she says, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. You've put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Ruth understands the cultural pecking order, if you will, and she understands that impoverished people and servants are very low in the pecking order, but foreign widows are no rights. And so she is stunned that Boaz is addressing her and even extending kindness to her when she doesn't qualify in the culture for anything except scrap up some gleanings if you don't get chased out of the field or worse. And yet at mealtime, Boaz invites her to eat with the workers, eating until full, making sure she had leftovers to take home to Naomi. Look at the instructions Boaz gives his workers, chapter 2, verse 15 and 16. Ruth got up again to glean. Boaz gave orders to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and do not reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the harvested bundles. Leave them for her to pick up. Do not rebuke her. Let her get a bumper crop of gleanings. Verse 23. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law, Naomi. She comes home with her gleanings, and Naomi is stunned at the haul. Sorry for the trite example. This is like a kid coming home from Halloween with a pillowcase full of goodies. It's bursting at the seams what she comes home with. And so her mother-in-law, Naomi, just says, wherever you've been gleaning, stay there. My goodness. We've kind of won the poverty lottery here of gleaning. In chapter 3, and if we had more time, we could walk through culturally what's going on there, but let me just summarize chapter 3 for you. A relationship, an appropriate relationship, develops between Boaz and Ruth, and it shifts from Boaz merely being the benevolent provider to an impoverished foreign refugee woman and her widowed mother-in-law, and romantic interests starts to show up in chapter 3, and you see specific cultural steps that they both take in that relationship as it's budding. And for the first time in chapter 3, we run across a phrase that is probably one of the reasons Ruth is so well known, and that is kinsman redeemer. It's kind of a mouthful to say, but if you just take the two words separately, it starts to make a lot of sense pretty quickly. Kinsman, who redeems you. So in Israel, God's provision, gleaning for vulnerable, including widows and foreigners. And for someone who's in the situation Naomi is, where there's no husband and there's no sons, so the family name is going to go extinct and end with Naomi, unless somebody who shares the family name will take them on as kinsman redeemer, which means you take on the responsibility to provide for them. They now become your responsibility. And that right went to the closest relative, the kinsman, and their role was to redeem, to meet the needs and take care of what was lacking, to enfold a vulnerable person into their family as their own. Sort of like adoption today, where you take on that last name, you take on legal rights, and you become an heir. All of that was part of kinsman redeemer, and it was sketched out who is first in line and who's second in line and who's third in line. The closest relative gets the right of first agreement or refusal, which I doubt my ancestors had any biblical understanding of all of this, but that's why Kelly went to his sister Teresa, my grandmother. He had decided, I won't or can't raise these kids. And he basically was coming to his sister saying, will you be the kinsman redeemer? Which means you take on these three kids, you raise them as your own, you feed them as your own, you make them heirs, and you keep your last name, which was Kelly's last name, keep that alive in them. I am not going to be in the picture. I want to hand them into your care and your expense and your responsibility, they're yours. Will you accept them? To which my grandmother, for reasons unknown, but I suspect poverty and a chippy attitude toward her brother, said no. And there was no other kinsman in line. The next one in line was the foster care system. Not exactly a kinsman redeemer with a warm, glowing heart, although a provision. So that's what surfaces in chapter 3. As Boaz starts having personal interest in Ruth, and she has personal interest in Boaz, although she's going to mute that because she's a foreigner immigrant with no rights. And Boaz is already ahead of her. I'll redeem you, but the problem is someone else is first in line. I'm not the closest relative to Naomi. Chapter 4. Pretty cool story, isn't it? If you're looking for a title for chapter 4, and I realize it says in the Red Bible that it chose the phrase, Boaz marries Ruth. And my own summary of chapter 4 was, it's official. And here's why. You're going to see cultural things going on, and yet don't get lost in the cultural things, because underneath it, what you're seeing is God's heart for the vulnerable displayed through Boaz. Verse 3 through 6. The presenting issue is Naomi still is the owner of the land her deceased husband held, Elimelech. And so Naomi's going to sell the land. Now, whether that's because financially that's all she's got, that's the only asset she has left, or whether this is part of the overall thought process that Boaz, Naomi, and Ruth have, maybe it's both and, but in any case, that's what's being presented, is Naomi is going to sell her land, and the nearest kinsman redeemer has right of first refusal to buy the land. The issue, as it's presented culturally, is the land. Ruth doesn't show up until late in the deal, which tells you how low her status is. Verse 3 and following. So, this is Boaz speaking to the nearest in-line kinsman redeemer. Verse 3, he says to him, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. In other words, this is an official, notarized meeting. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I'll know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line, says Boaz. And so this unnamed closer relative says, I'll redeem it. Who doesn't want more land? Maybe at a bargain price, who knows? So the first in line, which isn't Boaz, says, sure, I'll buy that parcel of land. And now Boaz pulls out the trick card. Are you there with me? Verse 5, Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Now, it's not that he's simply saying, if you buy the land, then you have to marry Ruth. What he's saying is you have to preserve the family name, which means you have to not only marry Ruth, you have to have children with Ruth, children, more mouths to feed. And now the first in line kinsman redeemer has second thoughts. It's a financial decision, at least that's his explanation. Although, could it also be a prejudicial one? I don't want a foreign wife. I don't want a non-Jewish wife. We don't know because he won't speak that in public. But what we do know is, look along with me in verse 6, at this the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. In other words, what he's thinking is, if I buy the plot of land and I have to marry Ruth because I bought the plot of land and I have to have children with Ruth, now I have my own children, I have children with Ruth, and it's thinning out the inheritance I intended for my actual first wife children. So no, my interest now is gone. And then he says to Boaz, you redeem it for yourself. I can't do it. I'm not going to commit to that kind of financial commitment. It's at a minimum a financial commitment that turns off the first choice, kinsman redeemer. And the unspoken is he also turned off because I don't want a Moabite. They're the enemies of Israel. Verse 7 through 12. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So, the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. So he's officially dropping out and giving Boaz now the right of first refusal because the original kinsman redeemer has declined. Then Boaz, I'm at verse 9, Boaz announced to the elders and all the people. So it's a public, and that's why I say it's like a notary. This is formal, this is official, this is binding. It's done in public. And Boaz says, today you're witnesses. I've bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, and then he names the two deceased sons, Chilion and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, we're witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have, now they're going into their, blessing, congratulation comments. May you have standing in Ephrathah. May you be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Little do they know, they undershot. So, Ruth, after marrying Boaz, conceives, gives birth to a son. Now, it's just interesting. I'm not sure there's a lot of depth of understanding here. It's just interesting. After the birth of the baby, so Ruth's son with Boaz. Remember Naomi, the mother-in-law, the widowed mother-in-law whose sons died? Verse 14 and following, the women of the town said to Naomi, wait, I thought you were supposed to talk to the mom. They say to Naomi, praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. It means she was the nursemaid. The women living there said, are you there? Naomi has a son. Ooh, how do you feel if you're Ruth? Ruth not even acknowledged as the mother. Naomi's grandma. It's not her son. And yet culturally, that's how much Ruth counts. Naomi has a son. One of my children married a man from another country. We went to that other country to have the wedding. And then they did the family photo with all the extended family. So all of his family, because we were in their home country, and then the groom, my son-in-law, and my daughter standing there, and just before the photographer snaps the picture, the groom's mother, my daughter's new mother-in-law, puts her hand on my daughter's shoulder and shoves her out of the picture frame and orders her to stay out of the picture. That was a clear message. Ruth, by the women in town, is being treated pretty much the same. Oh, Naomi has a son. Surrogate mother happened to be Ruth. Wow. We don't read anything about if that was painful or if Ruth just understood culturally that's how it goes. But Naomi took the child in her arms, I'm at verse 16, and cared for him. Verse 17, the women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. Not a name that sticks unless you keep reading. He was the father of Jesse. Maybe that's familiar to you, maybe not. Jesse, was the father, are you still there? David. David's great-grandmother, an impoverished, widowed, foreign, non-Jewish woman. You're beginning to get a sense of God's heart for people, God's heart for people regardless of ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status. Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. In Matthew's genealogy, you don't need to turn there, I'll just quickly tell you about it. In Matthew's genealogy, chapter 1 in the gospel, and whoever chose the sequence, Matthew's the first gospel. So in the first gospel, in the first chapter, and it's a genealogy, and there are 5 women, which is unusual, who make the list in the genealogy of Jesus that Matthew records in his gospel in the first chapter. Here's the 5 women. Tamar, who became pregnant via deception and was incestuously pregnant, but she makes the list. Rahab, non-Jewish, Canaanite, prostitute, but the walls didn't fall down in Jericho without Rahab turning friendly to the Jewish spies. Ruth, fill in the blank, foreigner, non-Jewish. Bathsheba, adulteress, or assaulted by David, either way. And Mary, an engaged but unwed young teenage woman. Not the kind of list you would generate if you were trying to track genealogy. How do you feel when others label you? Because of your physique, your age, your education, your income, what part of town you live in? The list goes on and on and on and on. Never feels good to be labeled. The different churches I work with, I get labeled sometimes. I worked with a church with an incredibly high percentage of young adults. 98% of the people were under the age of 34. There were 3 of us over the age of 40 in a church of about 200. And I literally had staff members who were in their 20s and early 30s look at me and say, "But you're an old guy. What do you know?" Didn't feel very good to be labeled. In fact, they would say to me, that interim church happened to be in Hollywood, and they would say to me, Paul, and they would say it arrogantly, and I know that, you'll find out why in a minute. They would look at me and go, "Paul, this is L.A. You don't understand. This is L.A. I'd say, where are you from originally? Ohio, Syracuse, New York, South Dakota, North Dakota, Illinois, Nebraska. Was people leaving home to go out to the West Coast hoping to make it in show business as singers, actors, writers, etc. None of them were native Californians. But man, I heard that a lot. "Paul, you don't get it. This is LA, and you're an old guy." So finally I'd had enough of being labeled, and I said, "You know where this old guy was born and raised?" "Minnesota." "Guess again." "Oh, Midwest, Iowa." "Go ahead, guess again. I got time." "Dakotas?" Finally, they got tired of guessing. And I said, "I was born and raised 20 stinking minutes from here. I don't want to hear this is LA, you don't get it. You have wrongly labeled me. As far as I can tell, myself and one other 50-year-old guy in the church are the only native Angelinos in this church. Doesn't feel good to be labeled. Don't label others. What if Boaz had not shown mercy and kindness to the foreign refugee widow? The story would have been very different, and where would David get a great-grandmother? Who are the Ruths within arm's reach of you? And maybe you're already showing God's kindness and care in whatever way you feel led to. Or maybe this opens your eyes. And a final question, take it with you and think about it. In a culture that has politicized, and I'll put that on both sides, that's a nonpartisan comment, has politicized people that are vulnerable, needy, that depend on the kindness of others to survive. Put on your gospel glasses. I didn't tell you who to vote for, and I didn't tell you what policy. Policies still have to be figured out. But what attitude are we bringing to it? Because the gospel glasses say they're created in the image of God. They're loved, and Jesus died for them, and the world is sinful, and it'll mistreat them, and someday it may mistreat you, and maybe it already is or has. And then it says God's response is to generously give. He made him who was rich become poor for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Nobody was there for Patricia. She survived and is still sweet at age 95, but boy, a lot of scars along the way. Boaz showed up for Ruth, and it changed her life. It changed history. You never know what your human kindness to a needy person might do. Shall we pray? I invite you to take a moment and talk to the Lord about what is sticking with you from this walk through Ruth's story. If appropriate, a change of attitude, then talk to the Lord about that. Or perhaps you're seeing someone through a different set of glasses now and asking the Lord, Lord, what can I do to show kindness, to show care? And a number of you may already be doing that. I hope you feel the Lord's affirmation. Well done, good and faithful servant. Lord, open our eyes to see and imitate your heart. In a culture that currently is making too many human issues political issues, we need answers and solutions. But God's people need to reflect God's heart. This week, Lord, open our hearts, open our eyes. Use us to give the cup of cold water in Jesus' name. Use us as the hands and feet, as the presence of Christ where we live, where we work, where we play, where we go to school. And we ask for your help. We can get so easily distracted. We can so easily get drawn into the debates. Make us the salt and light of the world that you call us. In Christ's name, amen.